a Times Union podcast.
Previously on Long Buried, we met John Ramsey's first wife, Zoanne Billigmeyer, who left him not long before he started dating Karen Ramsey. Or maybe it was a little after. The timeline is hazy.
He was totally disinterested in our life.
I got to know John pretty well.
We also met John Ramsey's friend, Chris West, who seems to have been one of the few people John talked to about his time in Vietnam. And we met John's younger brother, Steve, who recalled that John told him the same story about Karen's disappearance that he'd given other friends and family.
The only thing that he directly had said to me, and I heard him say it a couple times, is that she was just tired of being married and being a wife and a mother and just wanted to leave.
Steve, Chris, and Zoanne provided valuable insight into what John Ramsey was like in the 1960s and 70s, before and during his marriage to Karen. They all struggle to believe he could have killed her.
Everybody has secrets for the most part in their life, especially if you keep living.
One of the many reasons why New York State Police investigator Joe Morrissey had come to suspect John Ramsey was the mysterious real estate transaction I told you about in the last episode. On September 28, 1981, John Ramsey sold the Holly Stream Court condo that he and Karen had purchased 4 years earlier. On the deed of sale, John attested to a notary that his wife still resided there. And a notarized signature for the name Karen Ramsey is on that document. But we now know Karen had vanished 16 months earlier. In fact, she was very likely dead when John sold that condo. So, who signed that document? I'm Philip Pantuso. This is Long Buried, an investigative podcast from the Times Union. This is the 6th and final episode. We tell ourselves stories. Before we begin, a word of caution. This episode contains references to domestic violence. Please take care as you listen. If you or someone you know needs help, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE or visit our website for a list of additional resources.
Now to some significant new information tonight. In a mystery dating back to 1980, state police say a Putnam County woman who disappeared that year was a victim of homicide. Her signature on
Let me address something important at the top of this episode. There is no smoking gun connecting John Ramsey to Karen Ramsey's murder. And because there was no investigation into Karen's disappearance in the early 1980s, it appears John was never interviewed about what happened to his wife before he died in December 2022, about 16 months before Karen's remains were discovered. But there is a decent amount of circumstantial evidence that points to John as a suspect, or at least strongly suggests that what he told friends and family about what happened to his wife wasn't true. One major piece is what Bob Beckerick, the Ramseys' upstairs neighbor, told me and told state police. After he heard a chilling scream from the Ramseys' apartment in the middle of the night, he saw John throwing out Karen's stuff. Did you ever see Karen again after that?
No. No. But I guess naive. I didn't put two and two together that there was going to be a murder.
Bob doesn't remember precisely when it was, other than that it was around the time police now believe Karen was murdered, the late winter or early spring of 1980.
When John had told him that, Karen had ran off and taken the baby, obviously we know two of those things are definitely not true. We know she didn't run off, and we know she didn't take the baby.
Another big piece of evidence in the case against John is this 1981 real estate transaction. And there are 3 things I want to tell you about that. The first thing I did after finding the 1981 deed of sale for the Holly Stream Court condo was compare it to the 1977 deed, when John and Karen purchased it. Since I knew that no one had seen or heard from Karen Ramsey since 1980, I wanted to see if the 1977 and 1981 signatures looked the same. John's signature is identical on both documents. Karen's is not.
As first reported by the Albany Times-Union, their signatures are on a 1977 document when they purchased the condo, and again when it was sold in September 1981. That's more than a year after police believe Karen vanished.
Second, remember in episode 4, we learned that John Ramsey was granted a divorce from Karen in November 1980 on the basis of spousal abandonment. To obtain that divorce, John had to serve the papers to Karen in the local newspaper and swear to the court that he did not know where she was. So it's suspicious, to say the least, that less than a year later, John Ramsey swore to a notary that his supposedly missing wife still lived in the Holly Stream Court condo that he was now selling. Let's break that down further. When Karen and John bought that condo in 1977, they both used the same notary and both signed on the same date. But it did not happen that way when John sold the condo. On the date that sale was finalized, September 28, 1981, the attorney who notarized John Ramsey's signature is the same one who had handled his divorce the year prior. But the person who notarized the Karen Ramsey signature was someone who, as far as I can tell, was not part of any other transaction Karen or John ever completed. Also, Karen's signature is dated August 17, 1981, 6 whole weeks before John signed the document. So it appears that whoever signed Karen's name had gone to a notary who did not know Karen or John. John then waited 6 weeks before going to his attorney to complete the transaction. I wish I could ask that attorney why he notarized John Ramsey's signature on this document, which already had his missing wife's signature on it. We know this attorney knew that Karen was missing. Remember, he was John's lawyer for the spousal abandonment divorce. But that attorney and the notary who handled Karen's signature are dead. This series of events stands out to New York State Police investigator Joe Morrissey, too.
He had put the ad in the paper saying that, his wife had ran off and he doesn't know where she is, right? And then not too long after that, somehow magically she reappears for a real estate transaction to sell the condo. So that was very suspicious to us.
What's more, by this time, most states required identification to get a document notarized. It would not have been easy for someone pretending to be Karen to get this deed notarized. They'd need legit ID.
We have good reason to believe that somebody, whoever impersonated Karen, had some type of identification. Now that we know that Karen was dead at that time, why would you have a dead person's identification?
The last thing to know about this real estate transaction is that, while the 1981 Karen Ramsey signature does not look like other verified examples of her signature, it does bear some striking similarities to the signature of another person, Elaine Calvano Ramsey. It's important to note that handwriting analysis is notoriously subjective. It's generally considered a pseudoscience. It doesn't always hold up in court. I am not a handwriting expert by any stretch, but here's my layman's take on what I see when I look at the signatures. The consonants in Karen's signature on the original deed are angular. She dips the tail of her lowercase a's below the line in an unusual way. They look like backward e's. The whole signature is bold, never letting up from the tip of the first K to the swoop of the last Y. By contrast, the notarized signature on the 1981 condo sale is distinctly lighter. Both the vowels and consonants are loopier. There are significantly fewer angles. It looks to me like the writer wasn't pressing down as firmly on the paper. The lowercase a's are completely different. Their tails remain entirely above the line, curving neatly into the R that follows. These two signatures, they just don't look similar enough to completely convince me that they're from the same person, no matter how much I squint at them. But when I do the same comparison between the signature on the sale of the condo and Elaine Ramsey's signature that I found on another public document, it's less of a stretch. Elaine's signature has a lightness about it. It's flowy and loopy. The whole thing leans to the right. The thing that jumps out at me the most are Elaine's lowercase a's. That is, there's nothing remarkable about them. They look like typical cursive lowercase a's, just like the ones on the condo sales signature. You can see these signatures side by side on our website, timesunion.com/longburied. One other thing I want to mention. You'll recall that I obtained photos from the scene on Sophia Lane where Karen Ramsey's body was found. I also obtained the evidence logs and forensic photos of everything investigators gathered. The concrete block, the flower-patterned underwear, the Bic lighter, the plastic garbage bags, and the red tape. But also, the real estate deeds I'd already found independently, property records of their neighbors at Holly Stream Court, a $25 check made out to Karen and John for their anniversary. Other items that don't tell us much about Karen, John, or this case. These logs contain every piece of material evidence that police collected during the investigation. There's a lot there, but one thing is conspicuously absent. They never found Karen Ramsey's ID. Was it Elaine impersonating Karen who signed that real estate document? We can't be sure. Elaine Ramsey has not been charged with anything in connection to this case. She denies having anything to do with this apparently forged document. State Police investigator Joe Morrissey pressed her on it during several interviews.
We kind of agreed to disagree on the real estate transaction, but, again, she just said she didn't do it.
Here is what we know about Elaine. Her part in this story is important, regardless of any potential direct involvement in the case. On October 10th, 1981, less than 2 weeks after John Ramsey sold the Holly Stream Court condo, he married Elaine. We know the exact date because it's in John's obituary. We also know, from several sources, that Elaine and John were romantically involved for nearly 2 years before they got married. They likely got together before Karen went missing, according to their former neighbor, Jeannie White, and Elaine's ex-husband, Ronald Bailey. They were certainly together when John sold the condo in September 1981. Chris West remembers going on a hike with John and Elaine the previous December. He remembers it for one very specific reason.
I remember hiking with John and Elaine, I guess it was at 1980 time when John Lennon was killed.
FYI, Lennon was shot on December 8th, 1980. Chris remembers that it was snowing on the day of the hike. After they married, Elaine took John's last name. Over the next 4 decades, she signed many publicly available documents. As I mentioned earlier, I found some of them. I also obtained a few photographs of Elaine from this era. It's not a stretch to say she could pass for Karen. They both have straight brown hair, parted in the middle, falling down past their shoulders. Both women have slender faces with high cheekbones and small, rounded noses. They both have slight, petite frames, at least in relation to others in the photos we found. Both wore glasses, at least sometimes. We also know that what Elaine told police about when she got romantically involved with John shifted over the course of multiple interviews with investigators.
She said that she had moved out of the condos in 1979 and that she really didn't get involved with John until, she said, about fall of 1980. And, by that time, Karen was out of the picture and she didn't ask a lot of questions.
This was not true, based on what Jeannie White and Ronald Bailey shared.
I asked him who took his place in the apartment when he left. And he said, no, Elaine stayed. I moved out, but Elaine stayed there, I think, until 1980 or 1981. And keep in mind, Elaine had initially told us she moved out in 1979.
Police did ask Elaine about the 1981 real estate transaction. She denied having anything to do with it, and she did not answer my questions on this subject or any other. As we noted before, she declined to be interviewed for this podcast. And it does bear repeating, Elaine Ramsey has not been charged with anything in connection to this case. But during her interviews with police, she did ask something that Joe Morrissey found interesting.
There was a point in her interviews where she did make inquiries about statute of limitations on forgery, but still stated she didn't do it. And that's really where we're at with her. You know, there was just some conflicting pieces of information, but no proof that Elaine actually had any involvement in Karen's disappearance at that point.
In case you're wondering, in New York State, the statute of limitations on fraud, including identity fraud, is 6 years. Even if Elaine had been involved in the forgery of Karen's signature, she could not be charged. I tried to get audio of state police's interviews with Elaine, but that part of my records request was denied. The reason, according to state police? Releasing the audio files, even in a redacted form, would, quote, constitute an unwarranted invasion of the personal privacy of those concerned. Elaine's potential involvement aside, there's still the looming question. Did John Ramsey kill Karen? And if he did, what was his motive? Why would he kill his wife? From the last episode, we learned that John wasn't a known troublemaker. He was never convicted of a crime. Many who knew him remember him as mild-mannered. They struggle to imagine he could have done something as heinous as murder. But we also know he had issues in at least 2 marriages. That when he came back from Vietnam, where he was a sniper, in the early 1970s, he was more withdrawn. And, as Joe Morrissey put it,
apparently he was an above-average drinker up until the end.
And we know that Karen had threatened to run away with the baby, more than once.
One of our interviews with Elaine had stated that, obviously it wasn't a good relationship and that there were some times where Karen had threatened to leave and take the child. So that's a pretty strong motive.
Would that hold up in a court of law? I'm not sure. We'll never find out. The truth is, there is no neat and tidy ending to this case. Too much time has passed. Too many pieces of information are missing. Too many people are dead.
The only people that really know the truth are, Karen Ramsey and the people living with him at that time and knew him, But even the people that knew him well still didn't really know. People lived with the guy and knew him and were like, yeah, his wife just disappeared. Nobody's ever heard from him. Like, everybody at least thought about it once, but nobody ever took that step to go, oh, he killed her,
It's also worth asking this question. If John didn't do it, who did? According to state police, there is no evidence pointing to any other suspect in Karen's disappearance. Police investigators did look into Ed White, Jeannie's ex-husband. Remember, he and Karen had had a brief relationship at Holly Stream Court in the late 1970s. Could Ed have been the killer? Let's look at him for a moment.
Ed White, he had some type of casual relationship with Karen. He was a handyman. He had a substance abuse problems, and he had some domestic issues with Jeannie, and he had some issues at work.
Ed White's substance abuse problem was with alcohol. According to Chris West, who knew him, Ed's drinking was so bad that he got kicked off the New Rochelle Police Department.
I remember one day the detectives came and took his weapon away. I guess he was released from his service.
Jeannie told us about this too. Ed's drinking and his temper. It was part of what police questioned her about when they first knocked on her door after Karen's remains were identified.
And he said, by any chance, does he have a bad temper? And I'm like, he already knew it because he had already spoken to my ex had gotten fired from the New Rochelle Police Department. So he already knew the whole story. So I said, yes, he does. He had a very bad temper. And he said, and did he know anything about construction? And I'm sure he knew it too, knew that too. So I said, yes. I said, so he said, I said, what does that have to do with it? He said, well, Karen was found in cement. So I said, well, I can tell you that my ex-husband never worked in stone at all. I said, he was a carpenter, and so I said, that's all he ever did. I never remember him touching stone or cement or whatever. But he said, needless to say, he said he's still on our list. He was a lot of things, but I knew him. I was married to him almost 10 years, and I knew him long before that. I said, I don't think he could ever kill anyone.
Turns out police also don't believe Ed White killed Karen. There are a few reasons why. One is that after Jeannie moved out of their condo in 1979, Ed also left. The condo went into foreclosure, according to Jeannie. Ed was no longer living in the area by the time Karen disappeared, and no one claims to have seen him there at any point after that. Police also don't think Ed White had a motive. By the time Ed left Brewster, his dalliance with Karen was over, apparently without much drama. And while Jeannie called her husband's relationship with Karen an affair, others who knew Karen and John at that time did not see it that way exactly. Some of those people, like Chris West, said they were in something like an open marriage toward the end.
I told the police that I knew there was a lot of wife swapping going on at the time where he lived.
Chris says John and Ed even tried to hook him up with Karen.
I don't know. I was just recently married and had a kid. So I was, totally disinterested, really.
The reason why we leaned off of Ed White was because he did not appear to have any type of motive. I know the word affair has been thrown around a few times in this investigation, but the truth is, when we interviewed friends and relatives and people that were in these social circles, it appeared more to us that it was 4 people, 2 married couples having more of an open relationship and consenting adults, less of an affair, if that makes any sense.
Police never got the chance to interview Ed White, though. He died in 2017 after spending the last several years of his life in an assisted living facility in Saugerties.
Me and my partner went up and we found him. Well, we didn't find him. We found where he lived. It was a facility in Saugerties. It's a facility for people who have lost some limbs. Most of the people there are in wheelchairs. From what I understand, he became a diabetic later in life and had lost some limbs. And we talked to the property managers there and they confirmed that he's deceased.
By the time Ed White died, he was no longer in regular communication with Jeannie or their children.
I said, I can get a funeral home to pick up the body. We'll have him cremated. I said, I just don't know who wants his ashes. Because I don't, my son doesn't. So anyway, finally, I guess they took care of it because we never heard anything else.
So that brings us back to John. There's one lingering question beyond the motive that we haven't addressed, even though I did ask it all the way back in episode 3. How did Karen Ramsey end up buried in concrete in the woods? Here's what we know. John had experience working with concrete, particularly DIY projects. He built concrete cylinders for a deck at the house he and Elaine purchased after leaving Holly Stream Court. And he'd done some stonemason work for a construction company Elaine's father owned on Long Island. Remember what investigator Joe Morrissey told us about the concrete box that Karen's remains were found in?
This particular concrete had a heavy sand content and a low stone content, kind of one of the weaker forms of concrete. It might have been an actual, not what like a store you get a bag from the store, but like an actual like mix that somebody made. And that, whoever did this might have some masonry background.
Morrissey compared the concrete to the type of quick set mix you can buy at any hardware store. The mixtures were very similar. He also noted that Elaine asked a question about the composition of the concrete, before police had told her they knew it wasn't commercial-grade cement. We don't know for sure how Karen's body and the concrete block made it into the woods. But because of the way it was constructed, Morrissey's theory is that it was transported there in one piece. The forensics lab identified traces of wood in the concrete, likely from a wooden frame that has since rotted away.
It looked like, a fairly well-edged off rectangle, but we were able to get some measurements and some weights on the concrete itself. The concrete was somewhere around 396 pounds without a body.
Police also don't have any theories about whether Karen's killer acted alone to conceal her body. But John Ramsey had a utility trailer that he used to haul dirt bikes, which could have supported a concrete block of that size, according to police. He could have done it without help. As mentioned earlier in this episode, a lot of people we talked to who knew John Ramsey struggle to believe he could have killed Karen. But not everyone. The person who supposedly knew John best is not so sure. Remember what Elaine told police.
She would make statements like, I want to believe in my heart that John didn't do this, but he probably did it.
I have to ask, how confident are you that John Ramsey killed Karen?
So this is a subject that I'm going to answer very carefully, only because I will say that I did meet some of John Ramsey's family members in this investigation, and they are really good people who had nothing to do with this, and they deserve better. His brother was a good man, Stephen Ramsey. I met both his daughters, and they're really good people, and they really all do deserve better from what has happened here. But I will say, based upon all the leads that we uncovered, all the suspicious behavior on behalf of John himself and somewhat on Elaine's part, I am very confident that if Mr. Ramsey was alive today, that he would be in a very difficult position right now.
We'll be right back.
In July of 1908, America was transfixed by the murder of a young woman in upstate New York.
Either Hazel came down here alive or dead. We don't know.
Oh.
I think she was alive.
She was found floating in a country pond, her death shrouded in mystery, her killer unknown. Was she murdered by a spurned lover? Was she leading a secret double life outside of her station as a governess to the wealthy residents of Troy, New York? Did she know too many secrets?
She was obviously trying to create a better life for herself, and she knew how to maneuver to make it work for her, and it worked until it didn't.
In this new limited series podcast from the Times Union, we'll go back in time to an era of wealth and prosperity, of rampant political corruption, and of secrets and lies in upstate New York. We'll unravel the mystery of the life and death of one young woman, and why her story still resonates more than a century later.
'Tis the last rose of summer left blooming alone.
Listen to The Girl in the Pond at timesunion.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Long Buried.
Yeah, I saw the sign for 43, right up by the stop sign there.
I think it was where we turned into, so I think maybe this whole section is 43.
Okay.
One afternoon in the early spring of 2026, my producer Jessica Marshall and I drove down to Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Westchester County. It's really a beautiful place. Thousands of headstones neatly line the gently rolling hills, which were emerald green on the sparkling day we were there. Just past the entrance, there's a large pond that reflects the sky above, with a fountain and a stone arch bridge. There are tall trees and curved lanes and two stunning mausoleum complexes that offer visitors a respite. It's also huge. Since Gate of Heaven was consecrated as a Catholic burial ground in 1918, more than 190,000 people have been buried there. Several of them are quite famous. There's Babe Ruth, James Cagney, Mary Higgins Clark, Charles Schwab. Dutch Schultz, the mobster, Condé Nast, the magazine publisher, Jimmy Walker, the 98th mayor of New York City, Bess Houdini, the stage assistant to her husband Harry. But the vast majority of the people buried here lived quieter lives. You won't read about them on Wikipedia. Among them are Clement and Kathryn Angelillo. In the fall of 2025, their daughter Karen was buried here too. It's not hard to imagine how Karen Angelillo Ramsey's story could have turned out differently, though. Maybe she never met John Ramsey at the Fireman's Fund Insurance Company. Maybe the pregnancy didn't introduce even more friction into their marriage. Maybe she maintained a closer relationship with her family. Maybe she never threatened to run away with the baby. Maybe no one ever killed her. But there's only one ending to Karen's story, and it's an ending all too common, particularly for women. Every year, 250,000 women and teenage girls are reported missing in the United States. Many of these cases are connected to violence, particularly male violence. Statistically, 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, according to the UN. There are more resources for survivors now, and law enforcement generally takes these cases more seriously than they did in the 1970s and 80s. But those statistics, they really haven't changed much over the last few decades.
I think the thing that affects me the most with this case is the fear of how many more Karen Ramseys are out there. How many more stories are there out there like this right now? Where, somebody went missing in the 70s or the 80s and, it just wasn't treated like it would be today. And too much time has gone by, and it's just something that isn't thought about enough today of this person. That's probably the thing that haunts me the most, is like how many more of these are, and I know there's definitely more of these out there. I think everyone has thought about, since this has come to everybody's attention, is how did this happen? How can this happen? One thing I don't want to do is point fingers at individuals and single anybody out in particular, but I will say that I think society in general at that time, everybody involved played a part, whether it be law enforcement, friends, family. It seemed that everybody that I encountered had some suspicion, some knowledge, but it was just apparently never enough for them to say something.
Apparently never enough for them to say something. This was something I encountered over and over again in my reporting. Did he ever tell you guys what happened?
Basically, she abandoned her child.
Uh-huh.
Now, did she abandon her child because she was dead? Or just disappeared? Don't know. Not much was said about it, and I was never interrogated back then.
The only thing that he directly had said to me, and I heard him say it a couple times, is that she was just tired of being married and being a wife and a mother and just wanted to leave.
I don't think the detective ever told me. Like, I didn't know Karen was missing. He said, well, apparently nobody did. So I said, what do you mean? He said, nobody ever filed a report, a missing person report. And I thought that was sad. And so I said, John didn't? He said, no. And I said, I know she had at least one sister. And he said, no. And I guess the sister said something similar to Karen takes off. Once in a while Karen takes off. So I said, yeah, but she was gone for how many years?
As of April 27th, 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice has listed 26,372 open missing persons cases. The crisis is particularly acute for Indigenous and Black women and girls, whose cases typically get a fraction of the coverage as those of white women. There's a term for this: missing white woman syndrome. Think Gabby Petito, Elizabeth Smart, Amber Hagerman. There are likely many more missing persons whose cases are unreported or lost to time for various reasons. That is, of course, what happened with Karen Ramsey. She vanished in 1980, was found in 2024 to have been murdered, and yet there's no missing person report, no record of an investigation. If Karen's disappearance had received any media coverage at the time she disappeared, I likely would not have done this podcast. But it was barely covered even after her remains were discovered, and there are still so many open questions. For example, it's impossible to say why, with any certainty, there was no attempt by police to find out what happened to Karen through the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and half of the 2020s. But it probably did not help that by the time she was killed, she had become isolated from her family and from the friends who knew her before John.
I never met a friend of Karen's. I never met a relative other than, John and Jennifer.
Police today think there might have been more of an organized effort to find Karen in the 1980s if everyone had agreed on what might have happened to her. But that was not the case.
There were some family members that believed John, and there were others that didn't believe him so much, but I guess there was never a giant fight about it, as far as I could tell. John, after Karen went missing, was bringing Jen around a little bit to see Karen's mother, and he obviously did not get along with the mother very well, and eventually decided to cut ties with them completely. So I think not too long after Karen went missing.
Karen's mother, Kathryn Ward Angelillo, lived until 2013. She was 97 years old when she died. She spent the latter decades of her long life in Parsippany, New Jersey. I tried to find people still alive who knew her, but haven't had much luck. If you're listening to this and you knew Kathryn, please get in touch. I want to know if Kathryn had ever talked about her daughter. Karen's sisters seem to have buried the memory of her in the past. Karen's oldest sister, Joan, still struggles to talk about this case. She declined to speak to us for this podcast. The obituary for Karen's other sister, Susan, does not mention Karen at all. I have some sympathy for Joan and Susan. I can't imagine what it would be like if one of my siblings disappeared. And if I wasn't that close with that sibling, and I knew that she was restless or unsatisfied with the life she had, maybe I too would choose to believe the happier ending to this story. That Karen wasn't dead, that she had run off to start a new life, and leaving her child behind was the price she paid for freedom. But Karen did not abandon her child, and, as I would come to learn, Karen's mother did not abandon her child either. I mentioned earlier that among the items in the state police case file was a $25 check made out to Karen and John for their anniversary. It was one of the last things I got from my records request. That check was from Kathryn Angelillo, Karen's mom. Karen signed it on the back when she deposited the funds. That signature is why it was in the case file.
One of my meetings with Joan early in the investigation, when we had figured out it was Karen, we had talked to family members about the real estate transaction and the suspicious signature. So Joan actually brought the check to one of the interviews just for us to have so we could look at the signature for comparison.
Karen's signature on this check looks exactly like the signature on the deed of sale from 1977, when she and John bought the Holly Stream condo. And it does not look like the signature on the deed when John sold it, 4 years later. But that signature is not what stands out to me about this check. Rather, two other things do. The first is when it was written. Kathryn Angelillo dated it April 1st, 1980. Karen deposited the check 9 days later, April 10th, 1980, according to the Marine Midland Bank stamp on the back of the check. Recall that the first time John told Karen's family that she had left him was 1 month later, on May 11th, 1980. Mother's Day, when Karen didn't show up for a planned brunch with her sisters. I asked investigator Joe Morrissey about the date on the check. What does that tell you, and when did you first notice that?
Actually, you had brought it to my attention. I was laser focused on the signature, but it probably wasn't something that would stood out to me because I'd already made up in my mind logistically how this could have been done. If you think about it, she was last physically seen that I could tell from her family members around the holidays of 1979. I couldn't really get anybody else to commit to a specific time after that. Now, if you're burying a body in the woods, as you know, the ground's going to be very hard in this region of the country. You're probably not going to be able to break dirt like that deep until probably April or May. And obviously we know she was reported missing as of May. So at that point, I had already decided that whatever happened between April and May.
Still, I think this is an important detail because it significantly shortens the window of time during which Karen went missing. And it means Karen apparently didn't see her family for the final 4 or 5 months of her life, even though her sisters and mother all lived within about an hour's drive. That lends credence to the suspicion friends had that Karen was isolated in Brewster. The second thing that stands out to me about this check is where it had been kept in the decades before it came into the possession of the New York State Police.
Joan had said that she found it in her mother's belongings, and that it was in some type of notebook, and that there were some notes in the notebook that appeared that the mother was doing her own little investigation in the notebook.
No one seems to know where this notebook is now, so I can't tell you what else is in it. But this revelation stunned and moved me. It seemed to confirm something a few of Karen's friends had said, that Kathryn Angelillo actually had tried to find her daughter after she disappeared, and that this effort may have even spanned decades.
There was a rumor that they hired a private detective in the 90s, and that the detective had told them that Karen had got a new identity, a new social security number, and, but obviously we could never get anybody to tell us who this person was or anything. Elaine said that she had no recollection of any private detectives ever coming around asking any questions, so the other side of the family didn't know either.
Carol Wheeler, Karen's close pal from high school, who was one of the last friends to see Karen alive, told me that she'd heard this private detective rumor as well. And she said that Kathryn used to call her every year to ask if she had heard from Karen because, according to Karen's mom, Carol would be the first person Karen would call if she wanted to be in touch with anyone. But Carol, unlike Kathryn Angelillo, always believed Karen was dead. Because Carol said she also knew Karen would have contacted her if she could. She never did. Here's
Angelillo. Clement, that's the dad and the mom.
Yeah. Where's she? At the Gate of Heaven Cemetery, Jessica and I eventually found the headstone for Clement and Kathryn Angelillo. But we were having trouble finding Karen, so I called the cemetery's office. We're here right now, and we found her parents, Clem and Kathryn. But we're having trouble finding her gravesite. They're together. They just don't have her name on the stone yet.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that solves it. So they're gonna add it to the stone at some point. Up to the family, sure. Okay. All right, thanks so much. That explains it. Bye.
Yeah, this has to be from.
Yeah.
Because if it was in the fall, it didn't have time for any grass growth.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
So they haven't even added her name.
I know.
Gosh, she's like invisible here too.
It's interesting because it's very it kind of makes it even more. I don't know. real, I guess, because we've been kind of talking about it in the abstract, but the bones that were dug up at that construction site are actually right here now.
Yeah.
They're once again buried.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something poignant, too, about the fact that she's buried with her parents, because we know the death of her father was a destabilizing incident for her growing up. She was only 16 when that happened.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have since learned that her mother did spend what sounds like most of the rest of her life in some effort to try to find her.
Yeah. It kind of gives you a sense of closure, even though we don't really have closure, I think, in a traditional narrative sense.
I haven't really known how to end this podcast. As Jessica said that day at Gate of Heaven, there is no closure in the traditional narrative sense. A year and a half after Karen Ramsey's bones were accidentally discovered in Paterson, New York, they were reburied in a more suitable place. But there is no justice for Karen's murder, and the discovery of what had actually happened to her remains an open wound for her family and friends. So where does that leave me, the person who, by work-related circumstance and by personal obsession, is now telling you this story?
How do you feel about that conclusion or semi-conclusion? How do you feel about that? Is that satisfying to you as a reporter?
No, because with any investigative story, you're trying to find out conclusively what happened and who's responsible. Journalism, works in the same way, or at least has the same goal in that narrow sense as the criminal justice system. And just like there will be no justice in a law enforcement sense in this case, there's not really a nice conclusion to my reporting. And so that leaves me slightly unsatisfied, But that's also just the way life is sometimes. I've been thinking about that Joan Didion quote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." Its meaning is clear. Stories give structure to the chaos and confusion of life. Their power is that they end. Maybe it's a happy ending, maybe it's a sad one, maybe it's something in between. But the ending gives shape to the story being told. It gives it meaning. John Ramsey told a story about Karen. Whether he believed it or not, that story allowed John to move on with the rest of his life. It seems to have been a full life, one that touched many people positively. But the story he told about Karen, it was not true. She did not run away to start a new life. She did not abandon her baby. She was killed and buried in concrete in the woods, 7 miles from where she'd lived. And she never would have been found before a totally random swipe of an excavator, 44 years later. There was only one end to Karen Angelillo Ramsey's story. And much like life itself, its meaning is a lot more ambiguous than closure in the traditional narrative sense. It all depends on where you're standing. So on that sunny spring day at the Gate of Heaven Cemetery, standing at the foot of the Angelillo burial plot, the robins singing in the trees, the Metro North train rumbling in the distance, I did not feel a sense of closure. But it did feel like an end. Long Buried is a Times Union podcast. This episode was reported and written by me, Philip Pantuso, with additional contributions from Jessica Marshall. It was produced and edited by Jessica Marshall. Editorial direction and fact-checking by Erica Smith and Casey Seiler. George Ruiz designed our logo. Our theme music was composed and performed by Martin D. Fowler, with additional music by C. Minor, Kronborg, Cyrus Farah, and Rob McAllister by Getty Images. Our web editors are Daniel Roberts and Kat Simon. Archival sound came from CBS New York. Special thanks to Frances Kathryn, Benedict Cupstis, Michael Frank, Nora Mashanik, Maria Silva, Sarah Trafton, and Kat Simon for your sharp insights and invaluable feedback on this series. To see photos and a timeline of this case, visit timesunion.com/longburied. If you have questions about the story or want to share any information you may have about it, email us at podcast@timesunion.com.